Dr. Rahmanda Campbell, a reading specialist who does great work, and she's going to tell us a little bit about how the evaluation process is working. So I think she has actually conducted virtual evaluations, one of the few people that has done it, and she's going to tell us a little bit about it. Thanks, Dr. Campbell.
Hello, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you so much for having me. And first and
thanks.
foremost, I just want to just extend blessings and prayers to everyone who is trying to help the families, the parents, and just taking care of yourselves. With that being said, in terms of the virtual process for the assessments, there are a few caveats. So I just want to kind of go down the list and share what can be done realistically and especially ethically based on validity and reliability of assessments as well. So in terms of data review, I have been conducting data review, which is that can be done remotely. It can be done once the parent sends me information through the email, which is a secure, confidential site through my reading clinic email. I've been reviewing RRs, reevaluation reports, IEPs, and any other data that the family may have from the school or from outside independent service providers. With that information, that pretty much dictates what the next process is going to be. Some other steps that can be taken remotely and done ethically are rating scales. So to get this process started, there may be interest inventories, there may be rating scales that the parent needs to fill out, there may be rating scales that the students themselves can actually fill out, and there may be rating scales that the teachers can fill out. I will, with a word of caution, I will say in terms of any educators that are in the child's life, just from an ethical standpoint, those rating scales should be completed by someone who has had access to that student within the past month. So knows their academic background, their social, their emotional background. That's critical as well. So those, and that's a lot of information right there before we even get to the assessment, just the data review that needs to take place, anything current and anything to get that process started. The other steps that I have been taking are the intake process. We have an intake form which gives me extreme depth and insight as to what the child has been struggling with. How long has this child, the student, been struggling with certain academic difficulties? What has already been put in place for this student? What has worked? What isn't working? And that kind of gives me more insight as to, number one, what type of assessment I need to conduct for reading and just holistically overall, as well as what types of testing instruments can actually be used. And with that being said, depending on the testing instruments, there are certain testing instruments that I do have access to that can be administered remotely from an ethical standpoint, from a validity and reliability standpoint. For example, I do have access to administering the WISC and the WISC remotely, which are two very popular, very critical assessments in terms of evaluating a student in terms of their reading background and if any disabilities or deficits are present. With that being said, I will also state a word of caution. Even though I have access to administering it remotely on my end, I know the background of my facility in terms of the level of noise, the level of distractions. And so that would be extremely, extremely critical to ensure that if I was going to administer that assessment remotely to another child, to another student, that they would also have that same type of setting. And that has presented a challenge. I have administered I started that process with a few individuals, but we have run into, quite honestly, some challenges because of the limitations. Because with families, they have multiple family members in the house. You know, parents are at home working, there are other kids in the house. Some families have other relatives staying with them. So it definitely needs to be a quiet, uninterrupted space to ensure, you know, just testing protocols. So I will state that with caution. In terms of face-to-face assessments, I have, with limitations, I have started to also start the process of testing at the Bala Kenwood office, which is on City Avenue, 225 East City Avenue. I have started that process with a client, and that is based on, number one, there was a consent form that the family had to fill out stating that that child has not come in contact with anyone with COVID-19, no family members, no one in the house, you know, no exposure at all, because again, we're protecting the child, but I also have to protect myself as well. The office is set up in a way where we are 6 feet apart. I actually sent Dr. Montgomery some snapshots of the office. So, you know, any families who may be interested, they can actually see what that space looks like between the distance between myself.
Let me see if there's a way that I can put them up right now, that would be cool. Sorry to interrupt you, but I might
Sure,
have a
sure.
voice. Yeah, okay, let me see if I can do that right now.
Sure, absolutely. So of course I will be wearing a mask. I have some orders coming in. I have a sneeze guard that I will also be wearing over top of my mask. And then I also ordered a plexiglass platform. So whether I'm administering the testing or the actual educational therapy, whether that's for executive functioning, whether that's for reading deficits or difficulties, or any other types of educational therapy that comes along with that process after the testing, there's a large plexiglass platform that will be between myself and between the student as well. So those are some parameters and safety precautions that I put in place just to ensure that we all stay safe. You know, this information is critical, you know, for the parents and for the students, but at the same time, we just want to be extremely cautious as well. And I will be, with caution again, today is April the 27th. So moving into actually the end of this week, going into May, I will be taking a closer look at the schedule to see, you know, what types of services that I will actually put on the schedule for May. Remotely, that can be done every day now with data review, intake forms, rating scales, that can be done. But in terms of the face-to-face with testing and educational therapy, I will be scheduling in May, but that is pretty much on a day-to-day basis. Once I talk to the families, once I get the background to see what the need is, that will help me to better prepare and make sure that we have everything in place before we bring anyone into the office.
Perfect. No, that's great news, and it's cool to see that you've taken all those precautions and you figured it out. So definitely excited to see those pics. She's sending them to me now, and I'm gonna post them for people to see. So good work with that. With from whoever, you know, and I don't know, whoever the governing body is, like speech has ASHA, if like reading has some kind of governing body, are they providing any kind of guidance on how, like, are they tweaking the evaluations at all to make them more remote accessible? Are they providing any kind of guidance on how you can conduct the remote evals in case there are families who aren't willing to meet in person? But it sounds like pretty safe to meet in person the way you're doing it, but in case there's families who aren't willing.
Yes, well, I will share with two of the products that I use, which are very popular. They're used in schools. They're used by a lot of different professionals who provide independent evaluations and school evaluations. As I mentioned, the WISC 3 and the WISC 5, very necessary to conduct an assessment in the first place. So those are published by Pearson, and I've been using those products for years. I have license to use them. And as I said, there are platforms that would need to be set up, which I have set up on my end, but we would also need to make sure that the client is set up on their end as well. But with that being said, the caveat to that is when that evaluation is completed, my role would be to make sure that I document that this assessment was administered from a remote process. That definitely has to be indicated. Anything that is outside of the normal practice of face-to-face, you just want to ensure that that is indicated in the evaluation report. So for instance, we may be able to complete those assessments remotely, but there are other components that still need to be completed. So in terms of having a final report at the end, when the student does return back to school and when the parents meet with the IEP team, the child study team, we want to make sure that all communication is clear in terms of how the assessments were administered. But from a publishing standpoint, the reason that I have even taken on this role and that I feel confident in being able to administer it remotely is because of the relationship with Pearson and just knowing their background and that they have taken the steps from a publishing standpoint to ensure that it is an ethical process to begin. But again, we have to consider everything to ensure that that process is seamless.
Can you give any advice to parents on how they can track their child's reading progress? Because, you know, reading, you know, it's hard for someone who doesn't understand to be able to evaluate a child on the, you know, comprehension or, you know, anything beyond just recognizing sight words. How do you advise parents who have limited or no understanding of the reading process to keep track of their child's progress?
The first thing that I would do, and this is despite whatever the age or the grade level, the first thing is just having the child just read aloud. You know, everyone's home right now. So what better way to read to your mother, your father, your other siblings in the home, just the oral reading and listening for there may not be a teacher, but they can listen for fluency. They can listen for pronunciation. And even after that read aloud has been completed, or don't even wait until the reading is completed. In the process of the child or the student reading, ask questions. After that first page or that first paragraph or the first two paragraphs, well, what do you know about the story so far? It's kind of like, before you even start the story, let's talk about the title. Let's talk about any illustrations. Let's do a picture walk through the story. What do you think is going to happen in the story based on the title, based on the visuals that you see? Based on the title, what do you know about this topic? Are there any familiar words as the student or the child conducts the picture walk? And then, as I said, to have those conversations throughout the story, just to kind of stop, think about, what did I read? What do I already know as the reader, as the student? And this is conversation between the child and the parent or the other family member or another sibling. That dialogue is extremely important because they're able to assess, number one, understanding. They're able to assess comprehension. They're able to assess if the student understands those vocabulary words that are integrated into the story. So that is a lot within itself that plays a very, very huge part, even with the parent having limited background in terms of how to assess their child. But that goes a long way in terms of just the dialogue, the conversation, because you can tell if a child is just rambling, some kids are very intuitive and they are very clever and they can hold a conversation and give you all of this information that unfortunately has nothing to do about the story. So that in itself gives the family member insight. Okay, they know what they're talking about. They made the connection between the author and their selves. They made the connection between the author, what the author has communicated in the story, and another story that they read, or a character in the story. There's a concept called mosaic of thought. And so this is really centered around deep, in-depth comprehension and insight from the student's perspective, where it's text to text, text to self, and text to the real world. So right now, of course, we have a lot of real world situations going on. So whether they're reading something from materials that have been sent home, reading something from a newspaper, even simply watching a television show and writing a written response to it, something educationally, of course, or something that's healthy for the child to watch while they are at home. But that's how they can integrate writing into this process of staying at home, because what they write, guess what? They have to proofread it and they have to read it. So we're integrating reading and writing at the same time. So, I've said a mouthful, but those are several different tips that can be done at home with limited background for many parents, caregivers, or family members.
Yeah, I love that one because it sounds like a treat for parents and children, that you guys can watch a show that you both agree on and then kind of make the kid do some work after. I love that. Tamara,
Yes.
did you have a question for oh, sorry. Yeah, Dr. Campbell.
Oh, I was also going to say in terms of vocabulary development, because of course, a lot of children struggle with what they read because they have limited background with the vocabulary terms. So possibly even taking some index cards or sheets of paper and writing the words on them, possibly creating a word wall in the house. As you read the stories throughout the week or whatever you're reading, how many new words have you come in contact with? And then we can analyze, okay, what is the meaning of the word? What is the what part of speech is the word? How can we use this word in a sentence? And not even, we want to know the definition of the word. We want to know how to use the word in a sentence, but we also want to use it in everyday language. So there are different ways that we can develop the students' understanding and, more importantly, their use, their application of these words as well. So those are just a few other examples of what can be done.
Dr. Campbell, I did have a question. How would you redirect a student who was doing, like, on Epic, they have the verbal books where you listen to it. So how would you assess their comprehension of something that they're listening to, or if they're even paying attention? And the second question is, how would you get them to transition from that to actually reading the book out loud?
Okay, so those audiobooks, they're very good where the students can listen to them on an online platform. After they finish listening to the book or the story on an online platform, I would encourage them to read it back as well, because that way, number one, it's right there. They just heard it. So even if they were stuck on certain words, something is going to make a connection where it's going to reflect on, okay, I just heard that word. Let me try to make sense of it myself. And they're doing it right then and there. There's no lag time in between. After they read it aloud themselves, then that's another way to have that integration of conversation and dialogue as well, to reinforce what that story was about. And oftentimes, I know in a lot of those online platforms, because I use some of those as well within the integration of my educational therapy, there are different activities that the students can do that are centered around that that story that they just read, whether it's vocabulary, whether it's comprehension, whether it's a written response. And even if they're limited activities online, those are activities that the parent or the family member can create for the students based on what they read. And just as I said earlier, just those questions, you know, what do you now know that you didn't know before? Well, what made you think that way? What did the character do? What's the problem in the story? What character or characters help to solve the problem? How do you know this? Have them go back to validate and support whatever answer they're coming up with. Because children, we know they're creative. They're going to come up with the answer, whether it's right or wrong. But when we ask certain questions, probing types of questions, number one, it gets them to stop. It gets them to think. It gets them to reflect. And more importantly, it gets them to support where they came about to get their answer, which is equally important.
Cool. Dr. Campbell, do you know, for instance, like programs like Wilson Reading or other services that are provided on computers at school, are parents still able to access those programs at home during this time?
There are certain programs that can be accessible. There's so much online right now, and to be quite honest, there are a lot of companies, a lot of publishing companies that are providing free subscriptions between now and at least I know May, and some even up until June. There are actually a few that I'm using as well that I'm integrating for those families, you know, who don't feel comfortable coming out or having their student come out to the location on City Avenue or in Delaware. So for instance, there is a resource that I'm using called A Mirror, and it's specifically for kindergarten through third grade students. And that centers around reading fluency, assessing the students' reading, how many words they're reading per minute, and it's a good way to progress monitor. And they do have, I believe that's at a minimal, to parents, I'm not sure, if they're coming through the reading clinic, it's a very minimal to low cost, and I probably will even be able to get them to have access to it free, at least until May or June. But that's just a perfect example of a publishing company who has extended the service for that online platform.
Your website, is it still the best website, readingclinicinc.org?
Yes, and I just want to preface, a lot of times folks are trying to get in touch and sometimes they forget to put the Inc on there. So it is www.readingclinicinc.org, and they can reach me. The office number is area code 215-395-8591, and my direct email is dr, after the R there's a period, after the period it's R as in my first name Rahmanda, S as in sunshine, Campbell, my last name, CAMPBELL, at readingclinicinc.org, dr.rscampbell at readingclinicinc.org.
Okay, perfect. I just put all those links into the chat, but I'll also have them on the website. But any other advice you can give parents on, like, maybe, you know, signs to look for that maybe there's a problem?
Yes.
So maybe they don't even realize reading's a problem, but anything parents can look for?
Yes, just ensure, just make it fun right now, especially because we're all stuck at home. Just encourage their students, their children to read, to write something. Even it doesn't have to be so academic. You know, write about your day. What's one thing you learned today? What's one fun thing that you did today? They can read materials that they have at home, and signs to look for if they are reading something. Is there a lag in what their child is reading? Are there any hesitations? For instance, is the child reading slow? Is their reading, does it seem to be belabored? Especially considering what their grade level and their age is. Of course, if they're, you know, kindergarten through first or second grade, we know that developmentally it's just going to be certain expectations that we have for them versus a student who is in 5th, 6th, or 7th grade. So again, you know, think about what they should be able to do based on the age and the grade level. If there are limitations in understanding, comprehending certain words, even if it's math, certain concepts that we know that they should be familiar with at this point in time. For instance, I have a lot of families who call me and talk to me about math and word problems. Well, you know, unfortunately, it's probably some type of reading disconnect. So that child is, number one, trying to think of the math process that they have to go through. But because of their reading deficits, that produces some challenges as well because they don't necessarily understand what they're reading. So sometimes we have to break everything down to its smallest component. Let's take one sentence at a time. Let's take one phrase at a time. Let's take one word at a time if we need to. And so, you know, in terms of warning signs or red flags, those are just a few examples of what we want to look for the parents to look for in their children at home.
All right, perfect. And I asked other panelists, are you set up to accept compensatory education from the school district for parents who may want to utilize their services?
Yes, yes, I am. And that would be for whether it's for the testing process or for the educational therapy. It will be set up for both.
Okay, perfect. And again, I am recommending that parents that have access to Comp Ed, I think now is just as good of a time as any to use that. And I think there's a good argument that you can get any Comp Ed back that you used later on, because you're kind of, doing what the school should be doing, but you're doing it in a quicker way if you have access to that. And if you don't and you spend your own money, I think there's also an argument, a pretty good, strong argument to be able to seek reimbursement for that later on. So yeah, anything else, Dr. Campbell? We really appreciate having you on today.
Thank you so much for having me. And if any parents, family members, caregivers, if they have any questions, they're more than welcome to call me and email me. I'm on the computer, throughout the day and the evening. So I'm constantly checking messages. And if it's something, don't feel bad if you don't know something. I have parents that I talk to throughout the day and they feel so guilty. They feel so bad. You can't blame yourself in this process. There's certain things you don't know what you don't know until you are faced with it, which many of us are faced with at this point in time. So the first thing I want to say is no question is a bad question. Number two, please do not blame yourself. Don't feel guilty because you're not a teacher. You're a parent. You're working from home as well. So any questions that you have, ask me the question. You can ask me the question over and over. We want to make sure that, we have a clear understanding on what the child's rights and rights are in terms of faith, a free and appropriate public education. And, a lot of conversations that I've also had with some family members over the past few weeks is, understanding what your rights are and demanding. There are certain things that can be demanded at this point in time, even though we are all at home with this stay-at-home order. And that seems to be the biggest frustration for families. They don't know what their rights are. They don't know what to ask of the school. So, that's another way that I can provide some guidance and some consultation, because I have attended several webinars throughout the past month or so in terms of information that comes from the U.S. Department of Education, as well as information that's coming from the Pennsylvania Department of Education. So this is not Dr. Campbell stating this. This is information that I'm listening for, the most informative, up-to-date information as well to help guide family members and parents and caregivers.
Okay, yeah, that's really nice and generous of you. Parents definitely take Dr. Campbell up on that offer to email her. She's super responsive with email and genuinely wants to help. So the email address is there. So definitely reach out to Dr. Campbell. Dr. Campbell, last question. Of the frequently asked questions, which question have you heard the most from parents?
The question that I've heard the most is, will the school pay for an IEE? And if so, how do I go about getting that done?
Okay. Yeah, perfect. So again, I think that, if you're requesting an evaluation from a school at this point, again, every case is different, but my general advice right now is that if you're requesting an evaluation from a school at this point, they still have to follow those guidelines where within a reasonable amount of time, they have to respond to your request for an independent evaluation. So to that, I would say, write an email to your school, say, we want an independent evaluation for my child. We want Dr. Campbell to maybe do a reading evaluation. And if the school doesn't respond in a reasonable amount of time, it's probably safe to go ahead and get it and seek reimbursement later. Again, case by case basis, we'd have to really know the facts to give you a formal legal conclusion on that. But generally speaking, I think that timelines are running right now. And if you make that request and the school doesn't respond, then you're likely to get it. Or hopefully the school just responds and says, you know what, yeah, our reading evaluators are busy or they're not qualified. Dr. Campbell sounds like a great choice.